So back around 2013, my father had some property in upstate New York by Scroon Lake. It was a heavily forested area, and a part of the Scroon River ran between it. My dad had discovered a rocky beach by the river, and he decided one night to set up camp there. From what he's told me, it was a quiet night, where all you could hear were the crickets and the frogs from the nearby swamp. He was reading a book when he heard an unfamiliar noise. It was footsteps in the leaves. Naturally, he assumed that it was a white-tailed deer. They were pretty common in that area. He didn't think much of it, and he thought it was a cool experience to have one come so close to his campsite. But the footsteps kept getting closer. He was starting to get suspicious as to what exactly was walking near his campsite. The footsteps were now circling his tent, all the way from the shore to the tree line. All of a sudden, the footsteps started running towards my dad's tent. They crashed into the side of the tent at full force. My dad kicked and punched the person until they got up and ran back into the forest. He then packed up his gear and left shortly after. The next day, he found out that an ex-convict had been shot dead there by the cops just months prior. Apparently, the convict had been speeding, and he was caught by the highway patrol. He tried to hide in the hidden driveway that leads into the property. He ran and resisted until he tried to pull one of the troopers' guns from their belt and was shot dead. So that was the time that my dad was attacked by the ghost of an ex-convict. Pretty crazy story. I'll leave a link to a news article below. 8 years ago, when I was about 10, my family relocated to a small single-story house with the intention of renovating and flipping it. It was a heavily industrial-type area, and it wasn't originally designed to be a house. It was more of an office building. My parents converted the largest office into the master bedroom because it had a bathroom attached to it. My siblings shared another room on the outer perimeter of the house, and I got stuck with a smaller room towards the center, so there was no windows. When I first walked into the small isolated chamber I would be sleeping in, I immediately got the sense like I wasn't allowed in there. It was like I was breaking some kind of unspoken rule, and I couldn't shake it. I tried to distract myself by setting up my furniture and toys, trying my best to personalize the room and make it feel more welcoming. But the feeling just continued to strengthen. It was like I was vandalizing someone else's property. My door was open as I was finishing up, and at that moment I happened to be the only one in the house. I then heard the frantic scurrying of paws across the kitchen flooring up the hall. I'm sure most of you know the sound. I smiled and ran into the hall, because I assumed our dogs had arrived. The idea had been to keep them at our friend's place until we had a fence up in the backyard, but apparently the plans had changed. I caught the sight of a shadow figure lurking in the corner, and then it disappeared toward the main entrance as I called out to my dog. Then the sound stopped, and at that point all I could hear was the tense silence. I looked all around, but my dog wasn't anywhere in sight. There hadn't been a sound of a door closing. I went outside and asked my parents where the dogs were, and they gave me a quick reminder that the dogs wouldn't be coming for another few days. My 10-year-old brain couldn't process what just happened, but instead of trying to explain what I had seen, I just kept quiet. I spent the night in my siblings' room, half convinced that there was an animal running loose somewhere in the house. Fast forward about 3 months, and the house was coming together nicely, and I was feeling much more comfortable in my bedroom. The strange, unwelcoming feeling had subsided, and I was actually enjoying my cavern of privacy. However, one night I woke up to the sound of whispering in my room. I sat up and paused, half convinced that I heard my own name being spoken from across the room. I then reached over and flipped on my light, but there was absolutely nothing there. I turned the light back off and settled back into bed, and I would have dismissed this altogether if not for what happened next. I heard my younger sister start screaming from her room. I followed my parents down the hall to her room, where she was literally shaking in fear. She said that someone was calling her name from near the window. She stated that someone had been taunting her, trying to get her to leave the room and head to the small pond in the backyard. She said that she had seen something looking at her through the window. My father turned on the porch light and went out back to put her mind at ease. He came back within a few minutes and said that he hadn't seen anything. A few years later, after we had long since moved out of that house, my father did confess that he had seen something out by the pond. It was an animal of some kind, and he assumed it was a bobcat. He got the feeling that he was in some kind of danger from it. He then made his way back inside. My sister then told me that she couldn't sleep for the rest of that night, because she saw something with red eyes stalking around in the backyard through her window, coming into view every few minutes. Now here's where things start to get even stranger. The first two occurrences could be dismissed as imagination, paranoia, or nightmares, but even my parents began to feel uneasy after what happened next. Though they didn't show it at the time, it was in the middle of the day, and my sister and I were watching TV in the living room when we heard a thudding sound coming from across the roof. We collectively lost our minds because the footfalls were so heavy. We were convinced that a bear or something was trying to break in. We could hear the support beams in the ceiling straining under the weight. We hid behind the couch, which in retrospect was stupid. Heading down to the basement would have probably been safer if something was about to fall through our roof. When my parents got home, we didn't have to say anything because the footsteps hadn't stopped. My dad grabbed this rusty old pitchfork that he kept in the garage and went outside, ready to prod something down off the roof. He assumed that it was a dog of some kind. I should point out that our dogs weren't home that day, though I can't remember the exact reason. The only way up onto the roof was this dead tree alongside the opposite wall of the house, and my dad climbed up with no problem. But when he got to the roof, there was nothing there. Well, nothing except for a toy horse that I had lost the first week we moved in. There was also my sister's doll that she had brought home that day. And even when my dad stomped as hard as he could across the roof, he couldn't replicate the noise that we had all heard before. My parents had the tree cut down that weekend. There were a few instances where the TV would misbehave and turn off by itself during the night, but nothing of real concern to happen until that summer. The housework was finished, and we were all getting ready to move out, as a buyer had already been found. I was playing hide-and-seek with my sisters, and had chosen this chest in the back room as the best place to lay low. There were a whole bunch of coats and boots and random things in there, and when I climbed in and hid myself among the coats, I felt my leg bump against someone else. My younger sister seemed to have the same idea as me, and was already hiding in there. I didn't want to give us away, so I didn't say anything, but instead I just carefully shut the lid. There was just enough room for the both of us. I'm not sure how long we were in there for, but I heard my older sister walking through the room looking for us a couple of times, and after a few minutes of silence, I poked my head up through the coats and cracked the lid of the chest to get some air. Through the door to the next room, I could see my sisters looking around the family room for me. Both of my sisters. I screamed and shot up so fast that I smacked my head against the chest lid, and I made to scramble out of there. And that's when something grabbed my leg. It wasn't a firm grab, but it was more of a confirmation, like something was trying to say,
"I was here the whole time."
The whole chest fell forward, and I scrambled out, wailing like a siren and bawling my eyes out. When my sisters saw me, they began panicking, asking why I was so bruised up. I went to the bathroom and discovered that I had scratches and bruises all up and down my arms, legs, and neck. They weren't so bad that I was bleeding or anything, but I did look like I had let someone poke at me with thumbtacks for a while. My parents were convinced that my sisters had attacked me, even after I told them that I had been in the trunk. We moved away that summer. Looking back, it's funny how quickly abnormal things like that become totally irrelevant when you get a change of scenery. Life goes on. My family and I still remember those events, but rarely ever speak of them. Not because we're afraid. It's because we don't really see much point to it. I wonder if that's how most people adapt after experiencing something they could never explain. Dismissive and indifferent. Like it may as well have never happened. This happened a few months ago. I'm a 23-year-old female, and I had finally bought a car for myself. I loved driving around and listening to music. I usually liked doing this by myself. On this night, it was around 7 p.m., and it was wintertime. On this particular drive, I took 2 of my siblings. My sister was 18, and my brother was 13. I took them along with me after their constant pleading because they were bored. Now, I'm a smoker, and coming from a South Asian household, women are not supposed to smoke. So I took these opportunities to smoke without worrying that my parents would catch me. The city that I live in has some bad areas. However, we lived in a quiet suburban area. So I didn't give a second thought about parking somewhere, getting out of my car, and lighting up a cigarette. I don't like smoking in my car. So there I was, parked beneath a street light, scrolling away on my phone. It was getting pretty dark, but I wasn't too worried about it, as I would visit this road frequently, and it wasn't too far from my aunt's house. As I was smoking my cigarette, I look up from my phone, and I see a man emerging from some bushes nearby. I didn't think much of it. I see people walking around here all the time. This man was very tall, standing at least 6'4". He was on the opposite sidewalk. I assumed that he was just going to carry on walking, so I looked back to my phone. Until I looked up again and saw him standing in front of my car, staring at me. My sister, who was still in the car, must have been watching him as well, because she knocked on the window, telling me to come in. I had already put out my cigarette and was making my way to the driver's side door, keys in hand. The man was still standing there, not moving a muscle. I got in and locked my door and breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that maybe I was just overreacting. As I put my keys in the ignition, I looked up to see where the guy was, but he was no longer standing in front of my car. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw that he was now standing behind us. He was taking pictures of my license plate. I slightly rolled down my window, and I could see his face a bit clearer now. He appeared to be an Indian man with a beard and a hoodie over his head, obscuring some of the features on his face. I asked him as politely as I could, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The man comes towards my window, but still kept his distance. He then said in a very aggressive tone, "Do you know who I am?" I didn't know if he was asking a rhetorical question or not. "I have a lot of shit going on in my house. I don't need you parking here and watching me. You look real suspicious. Just randomly parking here with your 2 friends? What do you think you're doing? Get the fuck out of here." I chuckled nervously. I was trying to keep calm, but my anxiety was already halfway through the roof at this point. I didn't understand how I looked threatening in any way, as I'm a small girl who's been told that she looks like a kid. I was in my pajamas, and I was clearly minding my own business. "Look, I just parked here to smoke. I come here all the time since I live close by." That's when the man got right up to my window. He slid his fingers through the gap and forced my window all the way down, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get the hell out of here!" I screamed in terror and told him to stop swearing, as I had a minor in the back seat and he was scaring him. He then screamed, "If you don't get out of here right now, I'll damage your fucking car!" My adrenaline was running at full speed, and I was terrified. I didn't even bother putting my seatbelt on. I bolted out of there, and in my panic, I went straight ahead at a junction. It led me to a dead end. As soon as I stopped my car, I took the opportunity to try and calm down. My whole body was shaking. I couldn't even keep my foot on the clutch. My sister was quick to ask me if I was okay. But before I could even answer, I saw a pair of headlights coming right for us. It was the man. He was going at least 50 on a 20, and he almost crashed right into my car. But by some miracle, he just missed us. After his car screeched to a stop, he jumped out, and that's when I realized that my window was still all the way down. I quickly tried to roll my window back up, but the man was too quick. He then dove into my car. Half of his body was through my window. I screamed so loudly with his ear right next to my face that I'm sure I deafened him. He was trying to force my car keys from the ignition, but I thanked my lucky stars that with my car, to release the key, you had to have your foot on the clutch, which I didn't. With one hand, I was pressing down on the horn of my car to make as much noise as possible, so I could alert anyone who was nearby. I scratched his hands away from my car keys, and I heard my poor siblings crying their eyes out. My little brother had no idea what he could do to protect me, and my sister was in the passenger seat, experiencing all of this firsthand. I finally managed to force the man out of my car, and that's when he started screaming again. "I thought I told you to get out of here. Now I'm going to fucking kill you, bitch!" The deranged man then attempted to pull my door handle, trying to get inside, and that's when I floored it the fuck out of there. I didn't care that my body was shaking like a fish out of water. My main priority was the safety of my siblings. I knew that we were making a loud commotion. I laid down on my horn, trying to get the attention of anyone nearby, but nobody came to help us. I managed to maneuver my way out of the dead end, and then went down a new street, into a totally different area, and I then parked. I knew that this was probably not a good idea, but I didn't see the guy following us. The three of us just sat in my car, sobbing away. This was the first time that anything like this has ever happened to us. I called the police, and I immediately wanted to punch myself in the face when the dispatcher asked if I had gotten the man's registration number. Of course, in my panic, I didn't. I wanted to slap myself in the face, because I listened to a lot of horror stories on YouTube, and I always felt that they taught me how to handle certain situations. The dispatcher was very understanding, as was the female officer who called me the next day. As a woman, she understood how scary it must have been for me, and I cried to her as I recounted the incident. Unfortunately, the cops informed me that there was no CCTV cameras in that area, so there wasn't really much that they could do, especially with me not knowing where he came from. If he did in fact come from one of the nearby houses, I didn't know which one. The officer apologized to me, but it was really my fault for not mentally noting important information. They made a report of my attack, so if a similar incident happens in that area, they can make the connection. The officer said that when I parked my car, the man was likely doing something illegal nearby, and that's why he freaked out on me. I personally think it was just some deranged individual who enjoyed scaring people who looked like easy prey.
October 10th, 1999 was just another ordinary Sunday around our house. After the four of us returned from morning services, I helped Erin, my beautiful wife, finish preparing the last few sides for lunch. Just before noon, the children were called to the table, and, as usual, a great meal was had. When we were all satisfied, the kids ran off to do their thing, and I assisted Erin in cleaning the table. Once I had completed my husbandly duties, I slipped away to the living room to nap for the few hours. Around 3:45, I was awakened by a phone call from my grandmother Annie, my dad's mother and the only remaining grandparent or parent on either side of my family. She had raised myself and my sister after our parents had passed, and we were all very close. She asked if I knew any young men that needed work as a repair maintenance man. Her last guy had gotten too old to do the work, and she needed someone new to help around the house every once in a while. I helped her out as much as I could, but between my long hours at work and driving the girls back and forth to their various school-related commitments, I couldn't be relied on to do as much as she sometimes needed. Although I had no one in mind at that very moment, I told her that I'd put the word out and get back to her the next day. My first stop was to Erin. She had nothing for me. A few calls were made to various friends, but they couldn't think of anyone. However, they promised to get back with if the situation was to change. It was a waiting game now, so I plopped myself back down in the chair and dozed off again. A knock came at the door just as I began to drift off. The interruption annoyed me, and for a second I considered not answering it. I decided to go ahead, if just to stop them from banging on the door. When I opened it, I was met by a smiling young man holding business cards. He asked if I needed him to mow the yard. I declined his offer, but just then Grandmother Annie's request popped into my mind. He was about to walk away, and so I caught him and asked him if he could do basic repairs, things like fixing broken garbage disposals. When I asked this, his eyes lit up and he said yes. In fact, he had been a Mr. Fix-It in his last job, but unfortunately there was not enough work, so he was forced to fall back on lawn mowing to make ends meet. I briefly looked him over and thought about it in my head for a moment. He seemed like a nice, well-mannered kid. He said thank you, which is more than you can say about most people these days. Finally, I told him to give me a card. I might have a steady job for him. He did, and I promised to let him know in the morning. I let him go, and I returned to the house to enjoy my lazy afternoon. The next morning, I called Miss Annie, my family's name for her, to let her know I may have somebody, and I'd be sending him over that morning. When I hung up with her, I called the young man Mark and gave him the address. I told him he'd be doing small repairs and maintenance around my grandmother's house. At the end of each week, he was to come over to my place and I'd pay him. Once the specifics were nailed down, he thanked me and went on his way. With that out of the way, I focused on the task in front of me and put everything else out of my mind. When I returned home that day, I rang Miss Annie up to see how Mark had done. Her report of his work was encouraging. She spoke on more than one occasion of how eager he was to do well and his great attention to detail. This news was very pleasing to hear and assured me I'd made the right decision. Life would continue as normal. That Friday, Mark showed up at 6 p.m. to get his money and thank me, once again, for the opportunity. Dinner was just moments from hitting the table, so I had to cut our talk short. I told him to come around about the same time next week, and he took off, with what I assumed was a song in his heart and a smile on his face. This routine would repeat itself for the next several months. However, as time went by, Mark's smile would fade, and his appreciation seemed to become more of an attitude of entitlement. He got to the point where he wouldn't even say thank you, or anything for that matter, to me. He'd just snatch the money from my hand and walk away. While this behavior ticked me off, I didn't have to like him, as long as he did his job. I hadn't talked to Miss Annie for a while, so one Monday morning I gave her a ring to see how things were going. She said all was well, but I could tell from her voice something was bothering her. After a few minutes of coaxing, she admitted that Mark hadn't been doing his job as well as he had at first. Once a month or so had passed, he began making comments about money and not getting enough work. Since I was the one paying him, she had no idea how much he was making, so she said nothing. I assured her I was paying him plenty, enough money for a full-time employee, as a matter of fact. He had no reason to complain. When she mentioned he would get angry toward her and it scared her, I became a little concerned. Just to calm her fears, I told her I would talk to him that Friday. Even after we hung up with one another, her remark about being scared continued to eat at me. Miss Annie was very special to me, and the idea of her being afraid made me mad. I was determined to nip his behavior in the bud, but it became a problem, but I had to make sure I did so with a clear and calm head. Anger would only serve to exacerbate the situation and breed bitterness between us. I'd cooled off by the time Friday came around. In fact, I was in a pretty good mood. Spring was just beginning to rear its head, and I was looking forward to more sunny and warm days. Mark arrived at the usual time and had the now common scowl across his face. He attempted to snatch the cash from my hand, but before he could, I stopped him and said we needed to talk. He said nothing as I spoke, just stared with an annoyed look. I finished and asked if we had a problem between us and made sure to express how serious I was. All he could say was no and assured me we were cool before he slowly reached out for the money and pulled it from my hand. This time, he at least said thank you before walking away quickly. I couldn't be positive, but things seemed to be clearer, if not better. I wouldn't know for sure until I spoke to Miss Annie that Monday, but I felt optimistic about it. Things at work were very hectic that Monday, so I wasn't able to call Miss Annie until later in the day. Strangely, I got no answer, but figured she was out or busy and I could try again later. Work got busy again, and it was not until I clocked out that I could call her back. Once again, no answer came, but I decided to let it go until the next day. Tuesday morning was much quieter around the office. I had plenty of time to make a call. For the third time, she didn't answer. Now I was becoming scared. So I contacted the police and asked if they could do a wellness check. Miss Annie was almost 80 by then, and the chance of falls were high in people that age. I was told they would, and to call back in a few hours. However, it was they who called me back. The tone of the officer's voice uneased me, and he seemed to be dragging out things. This made me mad. I was already on edge from worry. Although I'm not proud of it now, at the time it was understandable. I yelled at him to spit it out, so he did just that. They had done the wellness and found Miss Annie dead. This was unexpected but not shocking. Assuming she'd died of a heart attack, I asked what the causes were. When he told me that she had been murdered, I blanked out for a minute. Never in my wildest fears had I expected to hear those words. He had to yell out a few more times before I responded, and even then, I felt like I was in a fog. This stuck with me for about an hour, but once I had to tell my family the news, the weight of it knocked me back into reality. The only information the officer could give me at the time was that she appeared to have been attacked by one or more people with hammers or blunt objects. If I would have my wits about me then, the second I heard the word hammer, I could have told him who it was. But that didn't turn out to be required. I give the cop credit for being kind with his words, even after I'd screamed at him. He could tell from my hemming and hawing what I wanted to ask, and assured me that there were no signs that she had been messed with, if you catch my drift, and I thanked him later for this. The rest of the family took the news almost as hard as I did. Miss Annie had become like a second mother to my wife, and my kids loved her greatly. We'd become very dependent on her after we relocated here, and the thought of her not being around was agonizing. It took a day or two before I remembered Mark and gave him a call. I didn't answer, but after I left a message to contact me ASAP. The longer I thought about it, however, it struck me as odd that he hadn't called me. The first day he received no answer at the door. He should have called me. My confusion would grow into full-blown suspicion once I discovered two important things. The pathologist determined Miss Annie had died sometime before noon on Monday, and perhaps the more scary of the two, Mark was still unreachable. The results came in that Friday morning, and the cops had been to his home twice and called him every day since I mentioned him to them on Wednesday afternoon. I expected to see him that evening to get his pay, but he never showed. This all but cemented his guilt in my mind. I told the police as much, and over the following weeks they would come to agree with me. Other than having his fingerprints and blood at the scene, everything pointed to him. All they had to do was get him in a room alone, and hopefully he would confess, but just locating him to do this would be a 5-year struggle. Countless tips were sent in, but none would pan out. Finally, on a rainy and cold morning in January of 2006, an arrest would take place across the country in Arizona that would put the search to an end. The Tucson police would be led on a high-speed chase after attempting to pull a man over for expired plates. At the end of the chase, Marco Javier Robles would be apprehended, and our search would finally be over. Marco was quickly extradited back east, and the trial was soon to begin. What we feared would be a long and drawn-out affair ended within the week. The district attorney had offered him a very generous plea, and after a strong recommendation from his attorney, he agreed. He'll have to do at least 25 years, but after that, it's up to the parole board. If I have any sway in the matter, I'll do my best to see that he dies in there. We were left with only one question. Some would say the most important one, perhaps. Why? As a stipulation to his plea, Mark was required to tell why he committed the crime, and in full. According to him, Miss Annie had become very demanding, and he felt he wasn't being paid enough to put up with it. He had been planning on hitting me up for more money once summer came along. However, when he found out she had told me that he was unhappy with his pay, in his eyes, his chance for a raise was ruined. That Monday morning, he was angry about this and confronted Miss Annie about what she had said, and a fight broke out. He claimed she grabbed a poker from the fire set and hit him. In self-defense, he struck her with his hammer, but only did so once. His intent was never to end her life, only to make her stop. Unfortunately, it did just that and more, and my family will never be the same because of it. A less rational man than myself would probably put some, if not all, the blame onto myself for hiring the guy. I, however, am not that man. No one else but Mark is responsible for Miss Annie's death. Any other conclusion would be foolish and a desecration to her memory. If there is anything I would say I feel guilty about, it would be that my children weren't able to spend as much time with her as I did growing up. A better example of selfless love and kindness never existed, and I savor every memory I have of her. I hope I can live up to her example and teach my children to be half the human being she was. I've had a few delivery jobs that have given me the creeps. One or two that I was pretty sure I was about to be robbed. Another was a gunfight between gang members unfolding in the street I was delivering to, right as I was turning onto it. But these are just occupational hazards. Yeah, it sucks, but I guess you do get over them. Only one delivery job really, truly terrified me. The only one that scares me to think about even today. So we get an order from an address that none of us drivers had ever delivered to before. This normally causes some suspicion among us, since we're always pretty wary whenever delivering to a new address. A fair few first-time deliveries have resulted in an address getting blacklisted. Sometimes they try to stiff you for money or some other scam to get free pizza. Generally speaking, the drivers take turns delivering to a new address, and this time, it just so happened to be my turn. So once the order is completed and the pizzas are boxed up, I take them out to my car and punch the address into my sat-nav. It turns out the address is right on the edge of our delivery area, pretty much in the middle of absolute nowhere. It dawns on me that this could be the oldest trick in the book. Call the pizza into some hard-to-reach location, then demand it to be free once it takes more than 45 minutes to deliver. But, to my relief, I make it out onto this old dirt road with time to spare. Yet my relief doesn't last long. Not when I see the state of the address I'm delivering to. The house is so run down it looks like a squat, like it's been commandeered by the homeless as a place to avoid sleeping rough. There's a musty old pickup in the driveway, its wheels all askew from years of misuse. I mean, the place was just the very definition of haunted house. Needless to say, I wasn't expecting a particularly generous tip. As I take the pizzas out from the passenger seat of my car, I start hearing this faint, whining noise. My ears prick up immediately and I freeze, trying to work out just what the sound is and where it's coming from. I come to realize it's the sound of a violin being played, but more accurately, it was the sound of a violin being played very badly. These discording noises carried on as I walked up the dirt pathway toward the porch and the front door. The sound of some old violin bow being dragged across dry old strings that were way out of tune. Creepy, sure, but that's not what terrified me. When I knocked on the front door, the screaming cat violin sounds ceased instantly. A few moments of silence went by before I began to hear slow, heavy footsteps growing steadily closer. I can't be certain, but I'm almost sure I heard someone breathing on the other side. These heavy, labored breaths as I waited for the door to open. The silence was broken by a metallic snap of the door unlocking, before hurried footfalls sounded on the other side. Someone had unlocked the door, then scampered away from it as if they were overtly skittish about visitors. Hello? I got your pizza order here. I remember asking, feeling the tension rise as silence once again engulfed the scene. Come inside, mister. A childish voice came from the other side. I wanted to just turn tail and run at this point, but returning to the pizza place without the money for the pizzas would definitely mean a verbal or written warning from my manager. I already had one for turning up late. I couldn't afford another. So, reluctantly, I took hold of the door handle, turned it, and walked inside. The interior of the house was bathed in darkness, only a handful of weak oil lamps to give me any sense of the layout. A figure was crouched on a nearby sofa, the old violin laying next to it.
"There's 15 on the table there, mister."
The person sounded like a child, but they looked bigger than they should have. On the small, dusty coffee table in front of the couch, there's a pile of change in little piles. Normally, I'd have taken issue with this, but to be honest, I was desperate to get out of there at that point. I'd have taken any form of currency. As I stooped down to start sliding the little piles of coins into my cupped palm, I started to hear the kid's labored breathing again, but I dared not look towards him. I could see its legs in my peripheral vision, and even then, I could see how unnaturally long they were. This person was not a child.
"Sorry about the coins, mister. I saved them up. I saved them all up to afford this treat for myself. It's all I have."
I had told the person not to worry in the sunniest disposition I could muster. The last thing I wanted to do at this point was upset them. I pocketed the coins, barely having counted them. I'd come up with a difference myself if I needed to. Like I said, I just wanted to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, hastily thanking the person, I caught a glimpse of the person's face in the low light of the oil lamps. They were burned, horribly burned up and down their arms and chest. The scarred flesh extended all the way up their face and head. Only the person's features were obscured by a small rubber mask. The mask didn't even cover up their entire face, only a small central portion that concealed their eyes, nose, and mouth. The only thing I could really make out was that the mask had a long wooden nose, kind of like the puppet Pinocchio, whose nose would grow whenever he told lies. The small carved eyes were blank. I averted my gaze from the mask and was unable to return it. It was one of the most hideously sad and scary things I'd ever laid eyes on. Just as I had reached the front door, I heard that same childlike voice emanating behind me.
"Want to hear me play a song, mister?"
Before I even had the chance to answer, to tell them I was too busy with deliveries to hang out, they had grabbed the old violin next to them and began to whine out of tune. Although the strings were almost totally out of tune, I started to make out the tune they were trying for. You know the one. If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. If you go down in the woods today, you better go in disguise. For every bear that ever there was will gather there for certain, because today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic. I was in the back of the driver's seat of my car before you could say, "Nope, I'm out," scrambling to start the engine so I could make a quick getaway. I don't think they had any intention of hurting me. I certainly wasn't as in much danger as when those idiot Crip and Blood wannabes decided to shoot it out like right in front of my car. But something about that place still creeps back into my mind while I lay there in darkness trying to sleep. Something that means I'll never, ever make another delivery there. I'll quit before I go back.
I'm originally from Arizona, but I grew up in Nebraska, in a small town about an hour south of the South Dakota border. My life leading up to my living in Nebraska was riddled with abuse and a lot of childhood trauma. My biological father was abusive, and my mother was absent for part of my childhood. I am also bipolar and take daily medication to make my quality of life better because of what happened to me as a child. I currently reside in Oklahoma. To start, I never really experienced anything paranormal growing up. That is until my mom's boyfriend, whom she is still with to this day, came into our lives. He was a good man and ran a small hardware store at which my mom also worked. Before meeting him, she was married to an awful man that did terrible things to me, many of which I still go to therapy for to this day. After the divorce, we spent a lot more time at her boyfriend's house. The house was built in the early 1900s, and it was absolutely huge and beautiful. She never told us at first that it used to be an old mortuary. Her boyfriend's father, who moonlighted as a mortician, ran the hardware store in town, which was passed down to his son upon his death. Even after telling my brother and I, my brother being 12 and I 15 at the time, that the house was an old mortuary, it never really bothered us. We spent our summers there swimming and playing PlayStation 3, and genuinely having a good time. Quite honestly, the best summers of my teen years. I enjoyed it. The home was warm and inviting. That is, until you got to the basement. The steps leading down to the basement were steep, about 10 of them before you reached the bottom. The basement had flooded many times before, so there was no carpet, just cold cement. Immediately to the right was a refrigerator, the washer and dryer, and the cubicle shower, which was flush against the wall and was positioned so it was directly behind you when you came down the stairs. If you walked forward, there were 2 couches positioned in an L shape to the right. The longest one pushed against the west wall. To the left were 2 brick pillars that acted as support beams for the house, spaced 5 feet apart with a dirty old blanket hanging between them as a shield. Behind the blanket was a vertical rectangle of a room. One half was a wooden workbench of old tools and trinkets, a random toilet that actually worked, and in the far left corner of the rectangle was a small pile of remnants from when the house was an acting mortuary. There was a bathtub, no longer operational, piles of wood shelving, and a small metal table on wheels. I always felt anxious going into the basement. I never could figure out why, but the atmosphere down there made me feel uneasy. I would sometimes come down to the basement to get a soda from the refrigerator, and I always had the feeling of static across my back, my neck, and my shoulders. It would make my hair stand on end, and I never walked up the stairs like normal people do. I walked backwards, because there was always the feeling of someone right behind you, making your fight or flight response kick in. It was definitely not my favorite place to be. My first encounter happened when I saw a shadow dart across the wall as I came down to get a soda. I knew the shadow wasn't my own, and I even tried to duplicate it, but I couldn't. The shadow passed along the ground level window almost 8 feet up. There's no way it was mine. I left quickly and slammed the door shut behind me. But the main incident that cemented my belief in the paranormal happened when I was 15. I had just gotten back from swimming all day, and I was sunburned and looking forward to rinsing off. But of course, the only shower in the house was, you guessed it, in the basement. I grabbed some clothes and headed down to get it over with. I didn't want to be down there longer than I had to. I grabbed a towel from the wire rack above the washer and dryer, turned on the water, got undressed, and hopped in. The glass in the little shower was tempered, meaning you could see blobs of shapes and colors, but no real definition. I was rinsing off, and proceeded to close my eyes and put my head under the stream of water. I moved out of the way, wiped my eyes, and opened them. I froze. Through the glass, I could see someone standing there to the left. My mom was upstairs taking a nap, and my brother was on the second floor playing PlayStation. There would be no reason for either of them to be down there, especially standing still looking at me. I stared at the shape through the glass. That feeling of unease came over me again, but stronger this time. I stood there for a moment, gathering up the courage to open the door. Slowly, I pushed it open, never taking my eyes off of the figure. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. No one was there. I looked around, surveying the area, and when I was satisfied that I was alone, I closed the door, and the figure was gone. I hurriedly finished my shower, threw on a towel, and started to back up, up the stairs. Every step I took, I could feel the sense of unease growing, like an unseen mass filling the room. This happened many more times over the next few years, but I continued to see the shadow. I did my best to ignore it, but the feeling of unease never wavered. I never showered with either the basement door or the shower door closed again. Water on the floor be damned.
My grandparents had passed away within a few months of each other, leaving their house empty. There was talk of renting it out initially, but because of its poor state of disrepair, the family decided against it. No consensus about what to do with it could be arrived at, therefore it would be left to decay for another decade or more before I would stumble upon it. My aunt and I were going through my mother's things and discovered an old family photo album. Mom had gone off on one of her journeys, and no one was sure if she'd ever return. Her and I had been having an on and off relationship for years, so there was a lot about the family I didn't know. I came across a picture of her and I when I was just a baby, but I didn't recognize the house we were standing in front of. I inquired, and my aunt told me about the old Wheeler family house that had once belonged to her parents. No one had been there in over a decade, and she wasn't even sure if it was still standing. So, after half an hour of badgering, she agreed to take me out to see it. That following morning, we headed out of town through 30 miles of cornfields until we came to a turnoff that led down a long, weedy gravel road. As we crested the hill, I was taken aback. The house I saw before me, despite being run down, was still breathtaking. In its prime, it must have been the finest home in the county. My aunt pulled up within a few yards of it, and we got out. From what I could see, nobody but the occasional mowing company had been there in a very long time. I couldn't help but be in awe of the place. The vibrant pink and blue paint had long faded from its soaring towers, and the massive porch was beginning to sag in a few places. Before I entered, I wanted to take in every bit of the wonderful facade as I could. Around the back was the remnants of the old horseshoe pit and, what I was told, my grandfather's Ford pickup. Although the big house had long seen its best days, I knew I hadn't seen anything that could have compared. Maybe one of those beautiful Victorian mansions in San Francisco. Even those would be dwarfed in comparison to this. When I was ready, we climbed the concrete steps and entered through the back entrance. From the moment we cracked the door, we were overwhelmed by a hideous smell coming from inside. We assumed it was a normal part of having a house sealed for so long and continued with our search. Everything appeared as if it had been left where it was on my grandmother's last day, almost like a time capsule or museum. The lights were even still working. Only later did I discover that my mother had been paying the bills all these years in hopes someone would return and live there someday. Walking from room to room and seeing all the beautiful antique furnishings, I couldn't stop wondering why I had never been told about the house. Regardless of our frequent estrangements, I would have helped my mother with the upkeep of it. It was downright insane to me to leave such a beautiful place to rot. Then again, my mother's strange ways were the main reason for our frequent falling outs. As we made our way to the second floor, the smell only got worse. I suggested we cut our visit short and just take a quick look around. Every door was closed, so I went for the closest one and stuck my head in. This must have been a guest room or spare. Upon the bed laid a beautiful and elaborate quilt easily over 100 years old. My aunt was going through a cedar chest in a room next to me. I joined her and we discovered another much older photo album and decided to bring back with us to look at later. She closed the door behind us and I made my way toward the last room. Unfortunately, the closer I got to the door, the stronger the smell got. I was reluctant to open it, but I thought if the poor critter was where I could get to it, I'd take it outside and give it a good burial. Cracking the door, the stench slapped me in the face, and I lost focus for a moment. When I regained my composure, I was met with a terrible sight. Before me was not a dead forest creature, but a human being. The bloated body, now unrecognizable, laid curled up silently on the bed. I could feel my knees begin to buckle, so I turned as quickly as possible away and out of the room. My aunt was confused by my behavior and stuck her head in before yanking it out, quickly again. We both ran down the stairs where the smell was less potent, and I called 911. The officers spent a few minutes in the room before coming back out with a small piece of paper and a driver's license. One of them joined us at the table where we were sitting and asked a few questions about my mother. This made me nervous, and I began demanding he explain himself. A serious look came across his face, and he told us that the body appeared to belong to my mom. I didn't want to believe it at first, but when he handed me her license, I knew it was true. My aunt and I held each other for a long time and cried. The officer gave us a few moments before interjecting himself again. Then he asked me if I knew why she would take her own life. I had naturally assumed my mom had died in her sleep. She was an older woman, but the note he handed me made everything clear. She had been depressed for a long time because of being at odds with each other, and the last time we spoke, some things were said, and she feared she couldn't take it back. The morning after our argument, she decided to return to the only place that she'd ever been happy. Although she claimed to not be sure of what she was going to do at the time, the poor state of the house just sent her over the edge. The last sentence asked that I not blame myself for her death and that I move on with my life. The ending read simply, "Goodbye, Mom." A couple of weeks later, after everyone had time to deal with their grief, I brought the remaining family members together. After seeing the old house and realizing how the poor condition of it hurt my mother, I proposed we try to raise the money to renovate it. In light of what had just occurred, I wanted to at least try to create something positive from our tragedy. I was given their blessings and went to work. It took some time, but on the first day of spring 2018, the Historical Society allowed me to lead the first tour of the newly restored Wheeler Mansion. A great day could have been much better had my mother been there with me. No matter our differences, it was her who inspired me and the one who truly made it all possible.
For context, I am a 14-year-old, and 2 days ago, something very creepy and unnerving happened to me. I am on the cross-country team at my school, and our coach wants us to stay in shape during quarantine, so I was going on a run. I tend to run early in the morning, around 5:30 or 6, because the weather is cooler and less people are out and about. It's also nice to get your run over with so that the rest of the day is free. For you to understand exactly what happened, I need to explain the route that I run, so bear with me. I live in a nicer neighborhood in the U.S. My neighborhood is also near a major road. When I go on my run, I leave my neighborhood, travel down the main road, and enter a different neighborhood that is close to my own. This neighborhood has a low crime rate, is on the richer side, and goes along a big reservoir. It has lots of hills, and some of the bigger houses near the entrance of the neighborhood are backed up against some woods. I run through it because I like to look at the big houses, and sometimes some of the wildlife, such as deer, which sometimes makes its way out of the woods. When I run through it early in the morning, I get to enjoy the lack of people and the bird song. You need to understand that I run this route every morning, and no strange occurrences have happened with me being there. Now that you understand this setup, I'll tell you what happened. Like I said, this was 2 days ago. I left my house and neighborhood per usual, and ran along the major road to the entrance of the neighborhood that I usually run in. Almost as soon as I come across the first house on the street, one of the ones that is backed up against some woods, I hear a rustling in the bushes. I think, oh cool, it's probably one of the deer, and slow down to try to spot it. But it never came out of the bushes. So I pick up my pace and continue along. Not long after that, maybe 2 minutes later, I hear someone on a bike behind me. This isn't unusual, so I don't think much about it, until the guy on the bike says, "Beep beep." So I'm thinking, okay, maybe he doesn't have a bell or something, so I move over to the right to let the guy pass me on my left. But he doesn't. He stays right behind me, I'm not a slow runner, but someone on a bike would definitely be faster than me. If you have ever tried to go really slow on a bike, you will understand how hard it is to keep your balance. So I'm thinking, okay, this is really weird. I have a feeling that this guy is bad news, and I need to shake him. So I slow to a stop and get over to the side of the road to tie my shoe, which doesn't really need to be tied, and to see if he'll pass me. He doesn't. He just stopped. When it becomes clear that he isn't going anywhere, I get back on the sidewalk and keep running. Bad choice, I know, but I was panicking. Of course, the man on the bike follows, but even though my attempt to shake him didn't work, I did get a good look at him. He was tall and thin, with glasses, and he wore a Nirvana t-shirt. He definitely looked like a serial killer. As an avid reader of horror novels and an obsessive listener of scary podcasts, I was already thinking of the absolute worst possible outcome. I was going to be murdered when I had been out of my house for less than 10 minutes. Worse, I was over 2 miles from my house, so I was going to have to continue running. Now, I know that what I should have done was go to the closest house and let the family that lived in it know what was going on, but I wasn't thinking clearly. So I kept running, and the man on the bike kept following me at a meticulously slow pace. I was tired, sweaty, and near tears. I wanted to go home. Home was the only thing on my mind. I started looking around for ways to lose him or hide. Just up ahead of me was a sharp turn. My hope was that I could get around the turn faster than him, and then hide. Not a very well-developed plan, but better than being killed by a random person. I sprinted around the corner as fast as I could, right into a young woman who was out walking her 2 dogs. Big dogs. German shepherds, actually. I started to apologize profusely, trying to look calm. Apparently, I did not look calm at all, because she asked me what was wrong. The man was still behind me, practically breathing down my neck. I stared at the woman, pleading with my eyes, and said, "How is your walk going, Mom?" I prayed that she would understand, that she would play along. And fortunately for me, she did. She smiled at me and said, "Where were you? Me and your father were looking all over for you." We both then turned to look at the man on the bike, who looked extremely shocked. He turned around and quickly pedaled away, almost running into an oncoming car. As soon as he was gone, I broke down crying, telling the woman everything. She was very sympathetic and kind, and she ended up calling my parents to come pick me up. I was still sobbing when they arrived, and I had to catch my breath before telling them what happened. Looking back, I am almost positive that if I hadn't run into that woman, that something awful would have happened. I'm not sure if the rustling in the bushes at the entrance of the neighborhood was that man, or not, but I am completely content with never knowing. I have not been back to that neighborhood since, and I'm not sure if I ever will. I recently started school again, and as a part of my daily routine, I am required to travel to Toronto Monday through Friday via the train and subway lines. It's a good 2 hours one way, so I usually pull out a good book, pop in my headphones, and relax to some music. I, of course, being from out of town, have heard a lot of horror stories that many people have endured on the subway. Naturally, I thought most of it was just exaggerations and tall tales. Well, I was very quickly proven dead wrong. About a week ago, I had just finished a very long and grueling day of school, and I wanted nothing more than to just get home and relax as soon as possible. I took my usual bus route to the subway station and sat down on one of the seats directly beside one of the exit doors. Now, a little context. I am facing forward, looking at one seat ahead of me, across the aisle of the subway car. This seat was occupied by a woman that looked to be in her 20s. She was what looked like playing a game on her phone and was paying absolutely no attention to anything going on around her. Next to this seat opposite me is another seat that faces this lady on her phone, and it is this person in this seat that made my 40-minute subway ride very disturbing. Occupying this seat was another lady that looked to be about 40 years old and possessed a very creepy smile. I say this because she never stopped smiling. And I mean, she was smiling the entire subway ride. For the first half of the ride, she was staring at the younger lady on her phone, laughing and muttering to herself. She also would occasionally take her phone out of her purse and take pictures of the girl on her phone. About halfway to my destination, the younger girl that was on her phone left the subway car, and the smiling lady's attention was then directed at me. She turned to face me and gave me a huge, disturbing, toothy grin. I just stared at a poster on the roof of the train for what felt like hours. Eventually, she got the hint that I was avoiding her gaze like the plague and went to plan B. She opened up her purse and removed a tube of toothpaste. She then proceeded to ingest at least half the tube. I damn near threw up, but somehow held it together, even though while she did this, she was still smiling at me, while laughing, now her face covered in toothpaste. My stop finally came, and I bolted from that subway car as fast as I could. I got to the escalator and glanced back to the car. And guess who I see walking fast towards me, arms held still at her side, still smiling. I was understandably completely terrified at this point. I ran out of the station and to the bus. I made it onto the bus just as it pulled away from the station. I took one final look back, and there she was, standing on the platform, head cocked to the side, laughing and waving goodbye to me.
This happened not long ago. I'm 15 going on 16. I live in New York City and have had some strange late-night experiences before, but none as disturbing as this one. My parents were out of town. It was a summer night. I was at a pretty large party. There was quite a lot of drinking and smoking, which is expected at a party with a bunch of 14 to 20-year-olds. I'm pretty tall for my age, like 6'1", and I have a pretty deep voice, so I easily pass as older. I knew that I had to get home on my own, so I tried to regulate the amounts of drink that I had. At around maybe 2 or 3 a.m., I realized that I should start heading home. It was a Friday, and I didn't have anything to do the next morning, but still, I was tired and figured most people would be leaving soon anyway. For those of you that don't know, New York City's transit system runs 24/7, 7 days a week, so I wouldn't have any problems hopping on a train, even at 3 a.m., to get home. The party was in Far Rockaway in Queens, and I live in an apartment building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, so I had a pretty long ride to get home. I wasn't worried, though. I was no stranger to long commutes on the subway. I would take the train everywhere I went since I was like 9 or 10. I headed over to the Far Rockaway, Mott Avenue train station and sat on one of the benches. There's a screen that says what time the train will be coming, and this late at night it would be a while. After maybe 10 or 15 minutes of waiting, the screen showed A train, Inwood, 207th Street, 20 minutes. I waited for a while longer until I saw the headlights of the train coming down the tracks. The train arrived, but since this was the first stop, I had to wait about another 10 minutes until it would actually leave the station. I got on, and a few people exited, leaving the car empty. I sat all the way at the end of the car, so I wouldn't be next to anyone if anyone else got on. At this point, I was really tired and felt like I was about to just pass out right there, so I did. For those of you that don't know, New York City subway cars are rectangular with 3 doors on each long side which open at the stations and 1 door on each short side where people can walk through from other cars. I woke up a little while later to the sound of one of the short side doors close to me opening. A man who appeared to be homeless walked in, and the smell immediately hit me like a truck. I remember him having raggy clothes and tangled hair. He looked at me. "Hey, brother, you got $1?" Nah, man, sorry," I responded. "Come on, man, I know you got something," he insisted, smiling for some reason. "Not for real, I don't, I'm sorry." I didn't have any singles, just a few 20s, and I wasn't about to give this guy $20. He just stood there for a few seconds and said, "Alright, whatever," and walked away, still smiling. Now, this didn't strike me as weird at all, not yet at least. I've been living in New York my whole life, and I'd gotten used to all the homeless people in the subway and them asking for money. It didn't bother me. I looked out at the stop I was at. I was just in Brooklyn. The A train ran local at night, so my ride would be longer than usual. I figured I still had a pretty long way to before I got to the 42nd Street, Manhattan, where I would transfer to the Q train that brought me to the station near my apartment. So I went back to sleep. When I woke up again, I was in downtown Manhattan, I think like West 4th or 14th Street. I was getting close to my stop. I looked around and the train wasn't empty anymore. There was a guy sitting on the other end of the train with his headphones on, and in the middle of the car there was a guy sitting there, head down, muttering to himself. I was pretty sure it was the same guy that had asked me for money before. I thought that was a little weird, but I wasn't nervous or anything. I just figured he had some sort of mental illness or something. After a little while, I arrived at the 42nd Street station. The guy was still there, and when I got off the train, he must have been going in a similar direction as me because he got up and off the train also. Now, 42nd Street station is huge, and I needed to go all the way to the other side of the station to get from the A train side on 8th Avenue to get to where the Q train was on 7th Avenue. Walking through the huge station, specifically the passage that takes you from one side to the other, I'll admit was a little creepy. It was eerily quiet for a place that usually is packed with so many people during the daytime. The only other people around now were late-night workers and homeless people. I arrived on the side where the Q train would be going uptown towards my stop. When I got to the platform, there were only maybe 3 or 4 other people that I saw waiting for the train like I was. I walked over to the benches and sat down to wait. I looked up and saw that there was a guy a little further down the platform on the side from where I came from, standing there, muttering to himself, like having a full-on conversation with nobody. I couldn't make out his face from where I was sitting, but I was sure it had to be the same homeless guy that I'd seen on the A train. Now I was getting a little suspicious. Was he following me? The train arrived after a few minutes and I got on. I'd only have a few stops from where I was to my apartment, so there was no point in trying to sleep. The man boarded the same car as me, and I could see clearly now it was him, the same guy. There wasn't anybody else in the car at the moment. I wasn't entirely nervous, but at the same time I was definitely on edge now. I tried not to look at him to avoid eye contact. He was still mumbling to himself, and now I could pick up on some things he was saying. Random phrases like, "Should I? Maybe. Help me." When I got to my stop, I promptly got up and got off the train. Honestly, at this point, I wasn't even surprised when the man got off too, still talking to himself. The station was completely empty. It was 4, going on 5 a.m. by now. I walked through the station, up the stairs, toward the exit, ignoring the man who was definitely following me. When I got to the street level, I started walking faster towards my apartment. The station was on 72nd Street. I still had to walk a few blocks further up to get to my apartment. I looked back a few times to see the man, still behind me, speaking pretty loudly now. I was honestly more annoyed than scared at this point. Maybe it was the tiredness, maybe it was the little bit of liquid courage left in me, but I was seriously done with this guy's stuff, so I stopped walking, turned around and said, "Hey, can I help you?" "I just want some money. I know you got some." "Listen, I don't. Leave me alone or I'm calling the cops. He said something about how I don't know all the stuff that he's been through, and then just walked in the other direction, still muttering angry slurs under his breath to himself. I continued home, shaken but too tired to think about what happened at this point. I got to my apartment and went to bed. The next morning, my friend who lives in the same building as me called me and asked if I'd heard about what happened last night. I hadn't told anyone about the incident yet, so I said I didn't know what he was talking about, and he explained. Apparently a neighbor in our apartment building who was coming back from an early morning jog or something called the police because there was a man lying outside the doors to our apartment. As he was arrested, he was yelling and screaming, resisting arrest, yelling stuff about how his life was horrible and how he was waiting to kill that person last night that didn't have the heart to hand over any money to him. I assumed the guy that he was referring to was the guy that I had encountered last night, and the guy that he was talking about was me. And he must have followed me all the way to my apartment, which, given how tired I was, must have not been that hard to do without me noticing. Who knows what would have happened if the police didn't take him away? The man was obviously seriously ill, and I do hope that he gets the help he needs. All I can say to you all is be safe when you're alone at night. Especially in the city, always watch your back.
When I was little, like 6 or 7, I had dreams that I would wake up late at night and see my mom smiling and standing in the darkness of my bedroom, watching me sleep. I would call out to her, but she couldn't hear me. She would just smile and look at me. This was a recurring dream for years, and it was beyond terrifying. When I was about 11, my parents separated, and I went to live with my dad. Although I had told my friends about these dreams, for some reason, I never talked about it with my dad, until this one random night that we were eating dinner. I asked my dad what he thought the dreams meant. He stopped eating and sat there for a minute, and then finally said, "You weren't dreaming, buddy. Your mom has had mental problems her entire life. She loves you very much, but you weren't dreaming. She would go into your room and watch you sleep sometimes." This sent a shiver down my spine, and after a minute or two, we resumed eating. That night, while laying in bed, I realized something. Why did my mom not respond when I called out to her? She would just stand there and smile at me.
I should state that this was a few years ago, and I'm a tiny woman. Back at this time, I look like a teenager, so I've always been mindful that I seem an easy target or easier to fool. I had seen a job interview for a small business looking for a secretary. No experience needed, as they would provide on-the-job training, and as that's the kind of thing I was looking for, I applied. I heard back quickly and was invited to an interview. When I arrived, I was excited. It was a bit of a journey from my home, but it was in a beautiful old building on the 3rd floor with a modern layout inside, though you could tell it was very new as it was bare bones and very little had been unpacked. Still, though, if you have to work somewhere, might as well be a nice building, right? Anyway, the interviews seemed normal. I only encountered female members of staff, and they were all warm and lovely. The woman interviewing me was amazing and even sat talking to me for a while after getting to know me. When I get home, I wasn't in the door long before I get a phone call from them. I nailed the interview. Awesome, I thought, and I was offered the job. I was about to accept when I was told on the phone, "Okay, you'll come here tomorrow and we'll have the van drive you to where you'll be working." And I was like, what? Confused about what they meant. They then told me that I'd be meeting with customers on their behalf and talking and selling stuff. I was not comfortable with this, as it wasn't what I was interviewed for, but I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they had a second position that they thought I'd fit in better with. It wouldn't be that weird as a new company, and, while not what I was comfortable with, I should hear them out. So I asked more questions, and the woman on the other end of the line is getting more snippy and tense. Gone was the nice, friendly woman from earlier, and she would not reveal where I would be going or who I would be meeting with. By this point, plenty of red flags were going off, so I had to decline the offer pretty quick. For anyone curious as to what had happened, I reported this as it seemed very dodgy. But when they were checked in on, the floor was no longer occupied by them. They'd apparently just rented it for a week and were gone.
The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a later confirmed murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just got dark. It was twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up on us. At first, we thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. He didn't have any camping bag, nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night, with no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. The look was absent, blank, and weird. He didn't answer my boyfriend. He just kept walking right at him. Red flags going off at this point. When my boyfriend realized that it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed knife. He made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He said something weird. "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all were having a party." Remember, we were miles away from a single soul, and it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear with him, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers but asked what was going on. He didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were at our site. He asked, "How many people you got with ya?" He began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer. He carried on circling around our camp. Now bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in that direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light and no bag with camp gear. Nothing. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in the direction completely off the path. He walked for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him. It was dark. At this point, I was freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of my boyfriend. We had a talk about whether we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said, if anything happens to me, I should run. At this point, I knew it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said that we needed to get out of there and just to grab essential items. I was scared that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This is the type of guy who would probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk, kind of run down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience stuck with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why the guy was out there that night. I've tried. Now this was the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type in Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. And there was. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner, before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender, and he began to stab her. Somehow, she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail, and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of these details are the same as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time to approach us, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realize this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us.
My name's Gerald and I'm 22. For the past year, I've encountered a buttload of crazy people and have accumulated even more crazy stories. While most of them would make you laugh, the one I've chosen to share was terrifying while it was happening and still gives me shivers when I remember it. A little more than a year ago, I applied for and got a job at my favorite convenience store across the street from my house. I'd moved there my sophomore year in college and decided to stay after I left school. This little store has served as a savior to me. Living as young men often do, I had very little money, but I was always confident I could find something to fill my belly regardless of how much was in my pocket at the time. So, when the time came, I was no longer able to rely on my parents for money. The corner store was the first place I went for a job. I was in luck. Only the day before, one of the employees was fired for stealing from the register. I took his place, and I've been here ever since. Like any other corner store, we sell alcohol. Beer, wine, liquor, the whole boat. Naturally, this makes us a beacon for the local drunks. These folks have served as countless hours of entertainment. While most are harmless people, on one specific occasion, a horribly violent outburst occurred. It was a quiet Saturday night, about an hour before close. Most of the regulars had made their appearances, a few more than once. The two involved in this incident had been in around 7 p.m. and had just returned. They were, or at least appeared to be, a couple. I'd seen them around the neighborhood since I moved in. The owner of the store said they'd been customers since he bought the store, and that was 13 years ago. Although they were not very talkative when they came in, I never had any reason to believe either could be violent. However, that night something had changed. Upon arriving the second time, they went straight to the cooler containing the quart and 40-ounce sized beers. Nothing out of the ordinary, as I said, but tonight an argument between the two started soon after their arrival. Initially, I couldn't hear what it was about, but soon I could hear everything they said across the store. I minded my own business for a while, but once the female began screaming curse words at the man, I felt like I had to at least get them to take it outside. I wasn't sure what to say, but I began my walk to the opposite side of the small store. Before I was halfway there, the man started screaming back at the woman. I'm not sure exactly what she had said to him, but it had obviously infuriated him. Mere moments before, he had taken a quart bottle of Busch or some other cheap beer from the cooler. All of a sudden, he began striking down at the woman's head with it. I'm not sure if he thought it would break or if he intended on hurting her with the nearest thing, but strike after strike he continued. It was a horrifying thing to witness. I blame the entertainment industry for giving people the false impression of how easy it is to break a beer bottle over someone's head. I assure you, it's very hard. Following the 5th or 6th strike, the woman had dropped completely to the floor and stopped moving. The guy stood over her for a moment, but looked up when I assume he heard me running towards him. The second he saw me, he ran out the side door and disappeared into the darkness. The sight of her laying there made me sick to my stomach. The blood dripping from her ears was almost as shocking as the ever-growing pool around her head. It seemed like a bad idea to touch her, so I made the decision to let the paramedics check her for a pulse. When they arrived, she was still alive, but they didn't have much hope for her survival. The cops certainly weren't in any hurry to get there, but when they did finally arrive, 45 minutes later, I filled them in on all I had seen. From the way they reacted, I got a strong feeling that they were very familiar with the two. While on shift, a few days later, my boss called with some news. The female was brain dead, and her family had made the choice to let her pass. The cops would pick the guy up the following night. From the description my boss gave me, he didn't even seem to remember what had happened. The doctors that examined him said that it's likely he truly may not remember what he did, because of the many years of alcohol abuse had possibly destroyed his brain. Sounds like he might not get the full punishment due to him under the law. I'm not really sure how I feel about that. Sometimes it seems like people really do get away with murder.